Bienvenue à tout le monde. Je remercie Louise et puis ses encadrants de m'avoir proposé de participer à ce jury. Je suis François Pompanon, je suis professeur à l'Université de Grenoble. Et donc c'est moi qui vais avoir la lourde tâche de présider le jury pour cette soutenance de thèse. Donc je ne vais pas parler longtemps. Je fais juste une petite présentation en français. Le reste de la soutenance va se dérouler en anglais, y compris les questions. J'ai commencé par présenter donc les membres du jury. C'est bon, on les voit ici. Je vais vous demander, I will just ask you to say hello, so that we will appear on the screen here, and the public will be able to see you. Donc, ce travail a été déjà évalué par deux rapporteurs écrits. La première rapportrice est donc Elisa Thébault, qui est chargée de recherche au CNRS à Paris, à Sorbonne Université. Bonjour Elisa. Le deuxième rapporteur, donc, c'est Piero Visconti, qui est chercheur à l'International Institute for Applied System Analysis. Hello Piero, do you hear us?
Yeah, very well. Good afternoon everyone.
Okay. Good afternoon. Et puis ensuite, donc, Miguel Alojo, qui est directeur de recherche au Muséum à Madrid. Hello Miguel, do you hear us?
Bonjour à tous.
Et donc ce travail a été co-supervisé par Laura Pollock, qui est assistante professeure à McGill University. The sound is good for you, Laura?
Yeah, hello.
Et donc Wilfried, Thuiller, directeur de recherche au CNRS à Grenoble. Tu nous entends bien? Ok, donc je vais maintenant laisser la parole à Louise pour nous présenter son travail.
Hello everyone, thank you all for being here, both in person and online. I'm going to present the work that I did during the 3 years of my PhD, which I did under the supervision of Wilfried Thuiller and Laura Pollock in Laboratoire Alpine. And it's about accounting for food webs to protect biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. Biodiversity is generally defined as the variety of life on Earth across all levels of biological organization, from genes to populations, species, and ecosystems. And a common measure of biodiversity is species richness. So here, for example, we have 25 species. But of course, biodiversity is a lot more than just a collection of species. It encompasses the ecological functions of species, their evolutionary history and dynamics, and species interactions. Species depend on other species for food and habitat, and food webs are a representation of species, which are represented in nodes, and trophic interactions or feeding interactions, which are represented in the links. And food webs have been used by ecologists for many decades to understand the structure and functioning of natural communities. And biodiversity actually underpins human well-being. We tend to think that humans are separate from the natural world, but that is not the case. We fully depend on biodiversity. Think of the food that we eat. All that we eat comes from the living world. Pollinators ensure that we have food to supply. The oxygen that we breathe comes from photosynthetic organisms, which also regulate the climate through carbon sequestration. And seed dispersal by animals ensures the regeneration of these plants that we in turn depend on. So these are just examples of processes within ecosystems that we benefit from, and we call these benefits nature's contributions to people. But there's evidence that biodiversity is currently declining. The IBIS Global Assessment Report has showed that 1 out of 8 species are threatened with extinction, and the recent Living Planet report has suggested that since 1970, on average, populations around the world of animals have experienced an average decline of 69% in population size. And it's not just the species and populations that are declining, we're also losing species interactions at an alarming rate. And so consequently, nature's contributions to people are also declining. 15 out of 18 types of nature's contributions to people are currently declining according to the IPBES Global Assessment Report. And the only ones that are actually increasing are the material contributions to people. What this means is that the extraction of natural resources has been intensifying, and this has a cost. It's been degrading the ability of ecosystems to provide all the other types of nature's contributions to people, that we depend on, like the regulating benefits of ecosystems, like regulating air quality, regulating climate, seed dispersal and pollination, and also the cultural benefits have been declining. And we know why biodiversity is declining. There are 5 main drivers of biodiversity decline. This is land and sea use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species and diseases. Now let's take a look at a few of these drivers, starting with land use change. Because of the intensification and the expansion of human-dominated landscapes like croplands, pastures, plantations, and urban areas, the natural habitat of species has been degraded and sometimes even lost. And so land use change has caused worldwide declines in the abundance and diversity of species and ecosystems. A second driver of biodiversity decline is direct exploitation. This is basically overhunting, overfishing, which is basically hunting or fishing a species at a greater rate than the species is able to reproduce. In fact, historically, a lot of the actual extinctions of species happened because of overhunting. Here you see illustrated in grey examples of species that have been hunted to extinction in America on the left and Australia on the right. And you might recognise the Thuiller sign that was exterminated by European settlers at the beginning of the 20th century within just a few decades. And a great paper by Evan Frick et al. Showed that the extinction of these species has led to the simplification of the food webs because we lost a lot of interactions as a result of their extinction. Another driver is climate change, which is transforming ecosystems, and species are having to adapt or move. And because different species adapt and move at their own pace, that means that there can be mismatches between the interactions between different species. This has been observed, for example, between a species of bird and a caterpillar, which is the major source of food for the bird's offspring. But because of temperature rise, the peak production time of the caterpillar shifted earlier in the season, and therefore by the time the bird's offspring hatched, there was not enough caterpillars to feed the bird's offspring. And so this interaction has basically been compromised by climate change. Now, to halt this decline in biodiversity, conservation has emerged, and one of the best tools that we have is protected areas. And history shows that the actual purpose of protected areas has evolved over time. The very first nature reserves and national parks that we designated in Europe, in the US in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, were meant to protect beautiful wild landscapes. And then, as we moved on in the 20th century, we started to document species declines, and so the focus shifted to protect individual species within their habitats. And in more recent decades, there have been concerns that the decline in biodiversity was compromising the ability of ecosystems to provide benefits to humans, and so this sparked calls to protect ecosystems for their contributions to people. So basically, many different visions of nature coexist in conservation today. There's, on the one hand, preserving species and ecosystems for their intrinsic value, independently of the use that we may derive from them, and on the other hand, preserving ecosystems for their utilitarian value because we depend on them. And right now, countries around the world are gathering at COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity to agree on a global biodiversity framework. And one of the targets within this framework is to expand protected areas around the world to reach a target of 30% coverage by 2030. So this is a 30 by 30 target. And Europe, for example, has already committed to expand its protected area network to 30% coverage by 2030. Now, as you can see on this map of protected areas in Europe, they are already quite dense. In fact, they cover 25% of the European continent. But as we've just seen, some of the protected areas were established a long time ago. This is the case of Fontainebleau, of many national parks in the Alps, for example. And so they haven't always been designated in areas that are necessarily ideal or the best places for biodiversity, but rather in places that are unimportant economically, like mountaintops or the Arctic. And if we look more closely, a lot of these protected areas are in fact smaller than 1 square kilometre. So that makes us wonder a little bit about how representative they are of a European biodiversity. So the first question is, how effective are existing protected areas? And the second question is, given this target of expanding protected areas, where would be the best places to add new protected areas or expand protected areas? And this is likely to be quite challenging, expanding protected areas in Europe, because Europe is heavily constrained already by human-dominated landscapes, which are quite widespread. And a lot of them are, in fact, intensively managed. If you look, for example, at the bright orange, which is highly intensive croplands, you can see that they cover a large proportion of the European continent. And we know that high levels of land use intensity is one of the major threats to biodiversity. So we need to mitigate these threats to biodiversity somehow by expanding protected areas, for example, but also outside of protected areas. But given the competing claims on land use in Europe and the multiple values of nature and conservation, this is likely to be a really challenging task. So, to summarize, food webs represent species and their trophic interactions. Species and their interactions underpin nature's contributions to people, and now I'll use this acronym NCP for nature's contributions to people throughout the presentation. Biodiversity is declining due to anthropogenic threats, and conservation aims to prevent biodiversity loss and maintain nature's contributions to people. But major gaps remain in this overall understanding of the current situation. We're starting to get a fairly good understanding of how species and populations are responding to anthropogenic threats, but it's still not quite clear how species interactions and food webs in general are affected by anthropogenic threats. Second, we need to clarify how effective are existing protected areas and where to expand protected areas. These are still open questions which are likely to be challenging given the multiple values of nature that we want to protect. We also know that species depend on other species for food just as they depend on suitable habitat, so species interactions should in theory be used in conservation, but this is much trickier than it seems. And so interactions have been generally overlooked when we designate protected areas. And finally, we know that intensification of land use is a major threat to biodiversity, so can we envision scenarios of de-intensification of land use that would benefit species and nature's contributions to people, so sustainable land use change scenarios? To address these questions, I focused on the group of species for which we have best available data, which is European terrestrial vertebrates. There are over 1,000 species of terrestrial vertebrates in Europe, so these are mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. 1 out of 5 are endemic to Europe, and 1 out of 8 are threatened with extinction. And because these species are quite large and charismatic, we've been studying them for quite a long time, and so we know a lot about them. And so this rich knowledge has been synthesized within databases which my work was based on. For example, we know where species are distributed across Europe. We know which types of threats and human activities affect them the most. We also know a lot about their ecology, about their behavior, their preferred habitats, and so on. And very recently, we have a new data set that summarizes all of their trophic interactions between predators and prey. So let me detail a little bit this data set on trophic interactions, which is central to my PhD. So Luigi Majorano and colleagues have put together this large food web, which we call a meta-web, that summarizes all of the possible feeding interactions between all of the terrestrial vertebrate species in Europe. So as you can see, this is a very large food web. It's got 1,000 species, which are represented in the nodes, and 50,000 interactions, which are represented within the links. And so at the beginning of my PhD, this is what it looked like. It's sort of messy, and you need to organize it somehow to understand the structure of this large food web. So that's one of the first things that I did, was reduce the complexity of this food web while retaining meaningful information on its structure. To do that, I aggregated species within trophic groups. So within each trophic group, species have a similar trophic level, so top predators will be together, but they also have similar sets of prey and predators, similar degree, so similar number of prey and predators, and they're similar in taxonomy as well. So the trophic groups are useful because they allow us to understand the ecological role of species within their community, and they also allow us to simplify the structure of this large food web in a meaningful way. And so once you have the distributions data and the food web, you can combine them to reconstruct local food webs across a continental scale, like in Europe. And so we can then study the spatial variation in the structure and functioning of food webs across these. So now that I've presented you with the main data that I use in the context, we can now address the main questions that I want to focus on during this presentation. In the first part, I'll focus on threats. I'll ask how vulnerable are food webs to anthropogenic threats. In the second part, I'll focus on protected areas, so how effective are existing protected areas, where to expand protected areas, and can food webs inform conservation. And in the third and final part, I'll focus on scenarios beyond protected areas, and I'll ask, would sustainable land use change scenarios benefit species and nature's contributions to people? Now, let's focus on the first part. So, in a paper published last year, Mike Harford and colleague quantified and mapped the major threats on different taxa, so birds, mammals, and amphibians. And they showed that agriculture had the biggest impact across all taxa, and they also showed that different taxa are affected by different types of threats. For example, hunting and persecution primarily affects birds and mammals, while amphibians are more affected by agricultural intensification, pollution, and invasive alien species and diseases. But something is missing from this study. They did not consider interactions, yet if you're a predator and your prey is threatened by pollution, you're likely to be indirectly threatened by pollution as well. So species are part of these food webs, and the thing is we know very little about the impact of threats in the context of food webs. So what can food webs reveal about the vulnerability of biodiversity to different types of threats? To address this question, I combined two types of data. On the one hand, the threats data, so we know which threats are affecting which species, and then the interactions data, so who eats whom. And so I quantified the vulnerability not only of species, but also trophic interactions within the metaweb and trophic groups. So how did I do that exactly? Well, if we take this example of a food web with 5 species and 6 trophic interactions, imagine that the eagle and the rabbit are threatened by threat X, say agricultural intensification. That means that all of their interactions that they are responsible for, associated with, are also threatened by this threat. So we'd have 2 out of 5 species in this food web and 3 out of 6 interactions that are vulnerable to the threat in question. And so let's first take a look at the amount of species and interactions that are vulnerable to each threat type. On this bar plot, you see on the right-hand side the percentage of vulnerable species to each type of threat, and on the left-hand side in grey, the percentage of interactions that are associated with these species. So the first thing that we can see is that there's a symmetric relationship. The more species are vulnerable, the more links, which we expect. But then if we look a little bit more closely, we see that direct exploitation and agricultural intensification lead to there's a bigger difference between the number of vulnerable species versus the number of vulnerable interactions. In the case of direct exploitation, for example, this threatens 34% of the species, but 85% of the links. What this means is that if you hunt intensively in a given place, you're likely to disrupt completely the terrestrial vertebrates food web. So let's take a closer look at these 2 major threats. On this food web, you see the nodes that represent trophic groups, and the colour of these nodes represents the percentage of species that are vulnerable to direct exploitation. And so you see that the groups that are the most affected are top predators and also a few intermediate predators. And for agricultural intensification, You can see that it also affects a few groups of top predators, but not only. There are also a few groups of basal prey that are affected. So to really understand what's going on, we can look at the degree of species, that is to say the number of prey and predators of each species. So in the case of direct exploitation, the species that are most affected by this threat tend to be species that have a lot of prey, so predators with many prey. And in the case of agricultural intensification, this tends to affect prey species with a lot of predators. So you have direct exploitation that acts from a top-down effect, and agricultural intensification, which affects more the food resources of predators, which will act more from a bottom-up perspective. So what did we learn from this part? We learned there are two major threats to terrestrial vertebrate food webs in Europe, which are direct exploitation and agricultural intensification. And direct exploitation affects generalist top predators, and agricultural intensification is most impactful for predators' food resources. So now that we better understand the threats to European terrestrial vertebrates, we can start to think about solutions to mitigate these threats. So in the case of direct exploitation, a solution would be to legally, for example, protect species that are both highly connected in the food web and also vulnerable to this threat. And for agricultural intensification, a solution would be to reduce the use of pesticides, but another option is to designate protected areas to avoid habitat loss due to cropland expansion. So now let's focus on protected areas, and we'll ask how effective are protected areas, where to expand protection, and can food webs inform conservation? So we're interested in three different values of nature that motivates its protection. We have the intrinsic value of species, so basically species and ecosystems have a right to exist independently of the use that we may derive from them, and that should be enough to motivate their protection. But we also want to protect ecosystems that have a high cultural value, like heritage landscapes or areas that we go to for wild foods foraging. And we also want to protect ecosystems that deliver particular regulating benefits, like carbon sequestration, air quality regulation, and pollination, for example. So given these multiple values of nature, we're going to ask how well are species and nature's contributions to people currently protected in Europe, where to expand protected areas for these multiple values of nature, and can food webs inform conservation? So we can address these questions with the framework of spatial conservation prioritization, and the aim of this subfield of conservation biology is to prioritize areas across a region of interest that will maximize the representation of features, for example species, within a few but complementary areas. This is important because across a landscape that's heavily constrained, we need to prioritize conservation resources to maximize benefits to biodiversity. So how do we identify priority areas for conservation? Let's see how it works with an example. Say you have a landscape of interest and 4 sites, 4 candidate sites for protection and 4 species. And so you first need to quantify how common each of these species are across your landscape. So the eagle, for example, is present in 3 sites, so the fraction of its distribution in any site would be 1/3. The squirrel is present in 2 sites, and the frog and the snake are only present in 1 site. And so then you're going to sum the fraction of the distributions of each species in each site, and that will give you a value which you can use to rank sites relatively to each other. So here, in this example, if we have the resources to protect only 1 site, we would prioritize site C, which has the highest amount of biodiversity in this example. If we had budget to protect 2 sites, we would protect site C and B, because the snake is only present in 1 site. And if we protected 3 sites, so choosing randomly between A and B, we would be able to represent all species at least once. So I used Zonation, which is a spatial prioritization software, and I ran 3 conservation prioritization scenarios, 1 for each value. For the intrinsic value, I used all of the terrestrial vertebrate species in Europe. For the regulating value for regulating nature's contributions to people, and for the cultural value for cultural nature's contributions to people. And so the top priorities for species are irreplaceable areas that are particularly diverse or complementary and also could be endemic with endemic species. Top priorities for the nature's contributions to people would be ecosystems with a high capacity to provide the NCP, but also a high demand for this NCP. So then we evaluated the representation of each of these values within the European network of protected areas, Natura 2000, and then we looked at top priorities for the expansion of this protected area network. So first we want to know how much is protected, and we can first take a look at the protected sites that are larger than 1 square kilometre. And so these areas contain 23% of the distributions of species on average, 29% of threatened species distributions on average, 14% of key ecosystems for regulating NCP, and 12% of key ecosystems for cultural NCP. But we know that Natura 2000 also contains a lot of small sites, so what biodiversity is contained within them? Well, if we look at the amount of distributions represented, we see that the small Natura 2000 sites actually contain a significant amount of European biodiversity. So one of the first things that we could do is to consider expanding protection around the small but really valuable Natura 2000 sites. And the second thing that we can see is that despite the quite dense coverage of protected areas in Europe, we're still missing 58% of threatened species distributions on average, and also almost 2/3 of the distributions of all species and key areas for nature's contributions to people. So now we need to identify top priorities to improve the protection of species and nature's contributions to people in Europe. So where to expand protected areas? The answer is likely to depend on what we value most in nature. If we focus on protecting species, then we should target the top 5% priorities that are in orange on the map. And if we protected this 5% of EU land, we would reach the protection of 57% of the distributions of species protected on average. So this is a 21% gain compared with what is currently protected. Within these top priorities, we'd reach the protection of 71% of threatened species. And if we, on the other hand, wanted to focus on the regulating value of nature, we would prioritize the areas in blue on the map, which you can see do not overlap with the areas defined for species. And so, but they would allow us to reach the protection of 57% of key ecosystems for regulating NCP. And finally, if we wanted to focus on culturally valuable ecosystems, we would focus on the yellow areas on the map, which again do not often overlap with the other types of priorities. And so, but there would still be quite a large gain if we focused on either the priorities defined for species or the priorities defined for regulating NCP. So far, in this spatial prioritization, we didn't look at species interactions. And in fact, in general, in systematic conservation planning, we've tended to consider features, species, or NCP independently of each other. And this is because there is basically no real consensus or clear method to integrate food webs within conservation. And one of the challenges is there are very many different metrics that we can derive from food webs and potentially relevant for conservation. So I did a review during my PhD to clarify the links between different food web metrics and the purposes of conservation. I found that different metrics are relevant to different conservation aims. So what we need to do now is to test the benefits of integrating these metrics of food web within spatial conservation. And we tested one approach where we incorporated the need for predators to have not only suitable habitat, but also a diversity of prey. We did this together with Eleonore Chenebois, who did her internship with us earlier this year. And so we asked how different are priorities when you incorporate the need for predators to have a diversity of prey. So on this map, you see the outcome of the traditional approach, which only focuses on the suitable habitat for species. However, we also want to protect the interactions, and so this has rarely been done in conservation, and the question is, what does it change? So we ran a second prioritization, and these are the purple areas. And the red areas are areas of overlap between the two types of prioritization. So most of the time, these top priorities fall in the same places, which is good news, but 10% of these top priorities do not overlap. So this means that incorporating information from food webs in systematic conservation planning is likely to shift priorities in some areas, and it might actually benefit the persistence of predators in the long term within these areas of difference. So what did we learn in this part? We saw that protecting an extra 5% of EU land would achieve the protection of 57% of species distributions on average, or 57% of key ecosystems regulating NCP, depending on the value of nature that we would focus on. We saw that food webs are useful for different conservation purposes, and that if we include interactions in a prioritization, this can shift conservation priorities in a few areas. Now, we know that expanding or adding new protected areas is absolutely necessary, but it might not be sufficient to halt the decline of biodiversity, and we need to imagine sustainable scenarios of land use change that would go beyond protected areas to put biodiversity back on the track to recovery. So the question is, can we envision land use change scenarios that would benefit species and nature's contributions to people? The European Biodiversity Strategy to 2030 has proposed several targets to do just that, and one of which is to expand protected areas. But there's a lot of other targets, especially the intensifying agricultural areas through reducing fertilizer use and pesticides use, and increasing diversity within agricultural landscapes. And there's another target of planting 3 billion trees. So, as you can imagine, these different targets require a deep reconfiguration of European landscapes. And there are different alternative pathways to implement these targets depending on what we value in nature. For example, if you plant 3 billion trees and your focus is to store a maximum of carbon as quickly as possible, the outcome is not necessarily going to be the same, whether compared to if your focus is to restore biodiverse forests. So this plurality of nature's values has been really nicely conceptualized by the Abyss Task Force on Scenarios in the Nature Futures Framework, so the NFF short. And so the NFF highlights desirable future trajectories where the negative impact of humans on nature is reduced, and there are different ways to do that depending on what we value in nature. Do we value it for itself, for its benefits to society, or for its benefits for culture? However, whether these desirable pathways would have benefits for biodiversity and nature's contributions to people is not known. So we need to understand what would be the implications of these scenarios for species in NCP. And we can test the effects of the NFF scenarios through land use change scenarios. Uridu and colleagues have translated the narratives of the different NFF pathways into 3 alternative land use change scenarios for Europe, which apply the commitments of the European Biodiversity Strategy in light of the Nature Futures Framework. And so, importantly, they account for intensity levels of land use. So these are basically scenarios of de-intensification of certain land uses to reach environmental targets, while accounting for socio-economic requirements. And so to evaluate the effects of the NFF scenarios on species and NCP, we used SSP1 as a control, which is a traditional sustainable scenario that's used in land use change scenarios analysis. So how did we evaluate the effects of NFF scenarios on species? Well, we combined 3 different types of data. One, we have the IUCN range map for each species. Second, we have the land use map. And third, we have a table that says basically which land use classes are suitable in terms of habitat for each species. And so you can combine all of these data sets to filter the species range based on its known suitable habitat. And so we did that for the current land use map and also separately for the future land use change scenarios. And then once you do that, you can quantify the percentage change of suitable habitat within the range of the species in each scenario. And so in this imaginary example, the species would have gained a patch of suitable habitat compared to the current, and so there's a gain in suitable habitat within the range of the species. And so this is just for species, and then we want to know the impact on nature's contributions to people. And there are actually 3 dimensions on which we want to evaluate the effects of the Nature Futures framework. There's the intrinsic value, which is species themselves, but then there is the cultural and the regulating value. And this time we focus on the benefits that are provided by vertebrate species themselves. And so this database of NCP provided by terrestrial vertebrates didn't exist at the beginning of my PhD, so we built it together with Sarvan de Marquier, who did her internship with us in 2021. And so we built this database where we have species that provide different nature's contributions to people. For example, on the cultural side, we have some species that are listed to be of community interest, and so cultural interest for Europe. Some of them have a unique evolutionary history, so that's important for our natural heritage. And some of them are important game species, and some of them are important for wildlife watching and tourism. And in terms of regulating benefits, some terrestrial vertebrate species provide mosquito control, some of them provide agricultural pest control, or pine moth control, seed dispersal, and carrion elimination. So once we have these different species, we can start to test the effects of land use change scenarios on nature's contributions to people via species. Let's first take a look at the effects of the NFF scenarios on species. So overall, for the 3 different NFF scenarios leads to an 11% gain in suitable habitat for species within their range on average, compared with the current land use map. Whereas the SSP1 scenario, which is the one we want to compare the NFF against, only leads to a gain in 0.8%. And then in terms for different classes of terrestrial vertebrates, we see that, so for these box plots, represent the percentage change in suitable habitat for the species in the different scenarios, which are represented in colors, and the 0 line represents the current land use. So basically, if we're above that 0 line, it's a gain in the future scenarios. And so for amphibians, we have a significant gain in suitable habitat in the nature for culture and nature for society scenarios compared with SSP1. And for mammals, we have a significant gain in suitable habitats in the nature scenario compared with SSP1. For regulating NCP providers, the species that provide agricultural pest control and mosquito control experience significantly higher gains in habitat in all 3 NFF scenarios compared with SSP1. And we see a similar trend for carrion elimination, but this is not significant. And for pine moth control, there seems to be no difference between the 4 scenarios. And finally, for cultural NCP providers, we see that the nature for nature scenario benefits game species and species of community interest that are listed in the Annex 2 of the Habitats Directive. But there is no significant difference between the scenarios for the species of evolutionary heritage or that are important for wildlife watching and tourism. So what did we learn in this part? We've seen that the NFF scenarios overall lead to gains in suitable habitat for the species within their range, but that the effects vary depending on the species, on the NCP itself, and on the NFF scenario. Now let's move on to the discussion, conclude a little bit on these results, and let's see the limitations and the perspectives going forward. So, we asked, how vulnerable are food webs to anthropogenic threats? We saw that by combining trophic interactions data with the threats dataset, we found that there are two major threats to terrestrial vertebrate food webs. These are direct exploitation and agricultural intensification. Direct exploitation acts from a more top-down effect, while agricultural intensification more from a bottom-up effect by affecting predators' food resources. Then we asked how effective are protected areas, and we found that Natura 2000 covers around 30% of biodiversity on average, but we can do a lot better than that if we manage to expand protection in a few well-chosen areas, which are the top priorities. And if we did that, we could almost double the protection of species and nature's contributions to people, but that depends on the value of nature that we value most. Then we asked, can food webs inform conservation? We found that there are many ways in which food webs can be useful for conservation, but so far we didn't know how this could influence spatial prioritization. And so we tested one approach where we incorporated the need for predators to have a diversity of prey, and we found that this shifted spatial priorities a little bit, which is likely to benefit populations of predators in these priorities on the long term. Finally, we asked, can sustainable land use changes benefit species and nature's contributions to people? And we found that overall, the implementation of the targets of the European biodiversity strategy by the de-intensification of land uses in Europe would allow species to recover and NCP to increase by gains in suitable habitats. Now, there are a few limitations in this work that need to be mentioned. First of all, the data that I used strongly depends on expert-based data, so this is indirectly linked to actual observations of the occurrences and interactions of biodiversity. And in fact, a few years ago, we could not have really used observational records, but since I started my PhD, observational databases have only been growing. If we take the example of GBIF, which summarizes the occurrence records, there have been an expansion in the number of occurrences within this database. And for interactions, we could imagine mangle or globi that have also increased. And so it would be interesting to combine these databases with our expert-based approach to maybe make more accurate estimates of the distributions of species and their trophic interactions. Then I didn't include the plants or the invertebrate species in the meta-web, or maybe very indirectly, and yet these are the species that are the basis of all food webs, and they are not only the basis of all food webs, but they're also incredibly diverse and key for ecosystem functioning, and also incredibly abundant. Arthropods are the largest group of animals, and plants are the biggest group in terms of the biomass on Earth. But the problem is that there's so many of them, there's a big gap in data. We know a lot less about these species because also they're quite difficult to observe. And so this is a big challenge going forward. And finally, the results that I showed here accounted for species, nature's contributions to people, land use maps in the current and future scenarios. And you can see that it's already quite complex. But one thing that would be really essential to consider is climate change, because areas and protected areas in particular are likely to become unsuitable for species, or they may lose their capacity to provide nature's contributions to people in future climatic conditions. And so future prioritization should really aim to protect diverse and resilient ecosystems under the current and future climate and land use change conditions. Furthermore, we need to also optimize the spatial connectivity between protected areas to ensure that species are able to move across a landscape in the context of environmental change. And finally, this is all very nice if it stays within the context of academia, but we really need, if we want to make an impact, to collaborate with conservation NGOs and other stakeholders to make a difference. We can't implement these scenarios without working with them. And this is actually the focus of the European project Natura Connect, which I am really fortunate to join as a postdoc in a couple of months, and I'm really looking forward to that. And on that note, I would like to Thank you all for being here. I would like to thank my supervisors, Wilfried and Laura, for their support and guidance. I'd like to thank the members of the jury for evaluating my PhD, my colleagues and collaborators. As you can see, there's a really long list. I could not have done this without them. I'd like to thank my friends and family and Jack for their support and everything. Thank you.